talk a little bit about what I find a lot of interest in, which is essentially computer forensics, incident response, in most of the blue team style activities. So what I'm going to talk today about is some of the common threats that we see in the industry, as well as what types of artifacts and impact they leave for us to investigate. So what I try to do with this talk is essentially break out the difference between the red team, or let's say penetration testers or threat actors, versus the defenders in the blue team and the forensic side. So think about that and try and keep that in mind as we go along. And I will definitely make sure that we leave time for question and answer. I want to make sure all of your answers are, or all of your questions are answered. So a little bit more about myself. I've been working in the information security realm for about 11 years. And I've been fortunate enough to work in a lot of different areas of the industry. I started out at a small firewall company, learning about networking and firewall rules and basics of that. And then I moved into incident response consulting, kind of by accident almost. That's a fun story for later, perhaps. And with incident response consulting, I was able to travel around the world and learn about different industries and different companies that had a breach or a security concern, and investigate and learn from those and learn how to interface with a lot of different companies. So my 10 years in incident response consulting has really afforded me a lot of background with helping customers and organizations recover from incidents, as well as secure themselves to prevent them in a proactive stance. Beyond that, I got my bachelor's degree at the University of Central Florida in Orlando, and I've got several SANS certifications. I saw a question about training, and we'll talk about education in a little bit as well. But that's kind of my bio here. I've done a lot in this realm, and I'm happy to share what I've learned and some of the struggles and some of the joys of the industry. So thanks for taking time today and letting me speak about it.
And if students want to interrupt, feel free to interrupt. I'm happy to relay your questions.
Yeah, please, by all means. It's meant to be as interactive as possible. And this picture here, I always like to include this picture just because it's important to keep in mind things when you're caught up in work. It's nice to do things outside of work, and travel is one of those things that I'm really passionate about. So this is a photo of me in Antarctica. I've been fortunate enough to travel to all the continents. And so when I am not working, I try to find places with as little cell phone reception as possible to keep my bosses at bay. So that's what I've been doing here. And what I'm going to talk about now is what threat actors are looking for. So keep in mind, this is a little bit of a different kind of presentation. I'm thinking more from the threat actors, or in this case, it could even be a penetration tester's mindset, kind of the red team. Typically, you read about in the news and you see these articles about these advanced persistent threats and these zero-day attacks and all these super sophisticated things that are occurring. But what a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of that is hype. These things really do occur, don't get me wrong, but most organizations aren't facing those attacks on a daily basis. Most organizations are struggling with the basics of securing a network. And on the opposite side of that, threat actors have worked to essentially try and make their lives as easy as possible. So what they're doing is they're doing mass scans for easily exploitable vulnerabilities and services. They're trying to go with what they know works rather than have to come up with a creative attack on every organization out there. They also presume that most organizations are going to have some type of issue or gap in their security coverage. So whether it's an organization that buys a lot of new companies and through mergers and acquisitions is getting attacked and maybe has poor security practice, or maybe they have a high turnover and the security team just doesn't have the time to incorporate a lot of security in these smaller companies. The reality is organizations with under 500 people in them or so, and that's just a number I'm arbitrarily picking, these medium-sized businesses often don't have the budget and the manpower to supply proper security controls across the board. So attackers are targeting and waiting for that. And then when they are doing these types of things, they automate as much as they possibly can. They don't want to have to repeat themselves. So they set up scripts and bots and things like that to do most of their attacking, or as much of it as they can, to make a really hands-off approach. And so that's kind of what the threat actors are looking for. And once again, this is also the same thing for a penetration testing team. So as an offensive attacker, we're looking for those same types of things here. We're looking for those gaps in coverage, those vulnerabilities that might be there, or exposure that an organization may not be familiar with. And I use the term a lot, low-hanging fruit. Attackers aren't looking for those heavily guarded, or the attackers I'm talking about here aren't looking for those heavily guarded networks, those behemoth companies that have tons of security. I'm talking about the organizations that are just trying to make some money, or the threat actors out there that are doing bad on a medium level scale, because that's where most of these attacks are coming from. So what I did here is I took some screenshots. These are my examples for low-hanging fruit. Number one is a remote desktop. So I have a screenshot here of Shodan. Shodan, if you're not familiar, is a really powerful search engine. If you think of Google or Bing or any of those search engines as when you're typing in a search term, you're looking for text that matches in a website, Shodan is a search engine that searches systems looking for exposed network ports and configurations and details that are exposed out to the public web. So in this case, on the left-hand side, I searched for systems across the world that have remote desktop, port 3389, exposed out to the public internet. And I found over 2 million of them. And in this case, let's say that a good half of them are probably honeypots and people investigating and researchers. Even if not, that means there's over 1 million systems out there that are vulnerable to brute force attacks and some other stuff that I'm going to cover here shortly. Remote desktop, if you're not really familiar or haven't seen this side of things, remote desktop is a very commonly exploited service, and it should almost always be put behind a VPN or an application firewall or some other line of defense so you don't have a logon prompt exposed, meaning any of these systems, those 2.4 million systems, I could go into MSRDP and make a remote desktop connection and start trying login and passwords. That's just poor form. And it's exploited very heavily. On the right-hand side, you see port 445 SMB, and it kind of goes on here. The short version of this is there was an attack called WannaCry, and it was a ransomware attack that occurred probably about 2 years ago. And most people have probably heard that term now. It was a big media hype because it destroyed a lot of systems. But that attack was made possible because of a exploit found by the NSA. The exploit is called Eternal Blue, and that has been out for, it has to have been at least 2, maybe 3 years now. So this is a very, in my opinion, in terms of security, a pretty old exploit and vulnerability that should have long since been patched. Meanwhile, I can search for it on Shodan and find over 1 million systems that could be remotely exploited right now. They would be vulnerable, in theory, they'd be vulnerable to WannaCry attacks or any other type of attack against them. And so these are my low-hanging fruit. In my opinion, these are the types of examples of things that threat actors are going for. And your pen testers, they're looking for these types of things here. And so it happens all across the world, and people are poorly securing systems everywhere. And so I want to talk about some of those situations where having tools and technology in place to detect them are great, but there are a lot of edge cases out there. Now, I'm not going to read through all of these. I'll let you go through, but the idea here is that there are a lot of situations, especially in a corporate network, where you might not have as much security and control as you think you do. There are a lot of scenarios here, like I'll just read the bottom one. An employee removes the antivirus from their corporate system because it was slowing down. This is something that happens all the time. For example, how do you manage these systems? How do you work with a team to make sure that these tools are deployed and running versus an attacker preying on a system and preying on users that are purposely slowing down the systems or turning off antivirus altogether so they're able to do this. So these are the types of things where it's really easy to say, oh, you know what, I can build a secure network and I can take an organization to the next level, but there's always going to be edge cases like this that are more difficult for IT and security operations. Now, as we talk about this, I want to make sure we talk about the red team as well. So this could be not just the red team, this could be threat actors and what they're trying to do. It doesn't really matter what the motivation of the attack is, whether it's approved or unapproved. The idea is that there's several areas in which a threat actor has to to go through the systems, identify what's available to them, enumerate those hosts, and do their research, and then get onto the systems. So right here, I would actually stop because I don't have a slide on it, but are you familiar, or have you all heard of the MITRE attack framework before?
No.
Most people have not.
Okay, great. I'm going to actually change my screen share a little bit. I'm going to go over to the MITRE attack framework real quick. Let me switch that over because that's important to show, because I think this is a next level tool that's being put out by MITRE. And let's talk about that. Let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see my Chrome screen here with the red banner on it now?
No.
No? Interesting. Okay.
Do you see now? Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So many of you might have heard of the term kill chain. If not, stages of an attack, things like this. There are a lot of different ways that an attacker can break into a system or steal credentials or do things of that nature. And what the MITRE organization went out and did, that's M-I-T-R-E, MITRE went out and decided that they wanted to try and create a mapping of pretty much every method of known attack. And so they call this the attack framework. It's spelled a little weird. The second A is an ampersand, but if you search for MITRE attack, you'll find it very quickly. But what this is, and it's really neat because this is a really powerful kind of matrix of details here. These boxes in gray, let me make that a little bit bigger. These boxes in gray at the top here, across this first row, each one of these is a major stage that a threat actor must go through in order to compromise, steal data, or essentially exfiltrate data from a host. So each one of these is a major phase of an attack for a threat actor to conduct whatever it is they're trying to do, whether it's steal information, credit cards, destroy a network, whatever it might be. Each one of these is a major area of that. Starting with initial access, after that they need to be able to have code execution, they might need to do privilege escalation, credential access, etc. And there's more over here. My screen won't show them all at one time. However, what's important here is each one of these sections is exactly right. So if we look at lateral movement, for example, an attacker might have to move from one system to another in order to find what they're looking for. Or to maintain access to the network and set up command and control, they might need to do things like that, or set up data exfiltration. So each one of these is a major stage of an attack or part of the kill chain as it's sometimes referred to. But under each one of these is a series, and each one of these columns is a series of methods in which they can perform that attack. Now, the one I like to use as an example under persistence here, I like to do bits jobs just because not everyone is aware that this is a real thing. So bits jobs, as an example, is listed under persistence. There is a utility built into, I believe it's Windows 7 and higher systems, called the Background Intelligent Transfer Service. Now, this was designed for system administrators to be able to make changes to systems and push out patches specifically to networks and areas of an organization that have really low bandwidth. Maybe they can't go and download a gigabyte patch because they're on a satellite connection or something very slow. So BITS is a service that will essentially stagger and slowly grab files from the endpoints, or to the endpoint rather. So it's an admin tool. But what was realized was that threat actors also like to use this tool. It turns out that you can have bits admin, or in this case, yeah, bits admin is the name of the tool here. You can tell it to go out to the internet and download files. You can tell it to set up scheduled tasks and set up persistence on systems. So it's a legitimate Windows utility that can be abused by threat actors or pen testers or anyone else with access to set up persistence. And in this case, that's where the example comes from. And so if you start looking through this matrix, if you want to, either as the red team or the blue team in your case, if you want to start going through and wondering, well, I wonder which methods of credential access there are, or I wonder how attackers are maintaining privilege or performing privilege escalation. This is a matrix that's highly documented, and quite honestly, you're going to see a lot of major security vendors and software providers mapping to this because it's so robust and so powerful. So if there's one thing you take away from today, it would be to at least take a look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, because this is definitely going to be a big aspect of at least the EDR and incident response realm. Any questions on the matrix or what I've covered so far before I go on any further?
No questions so far. You can continue.
Okay. I'm going to post in chat this link. I know you can Google it as well, but that's a really neat website to go and poke around at.
And I'll add it to the resources section of talks.
Great. And so this, in bringing it back to my presentation here, let me go back into the mode here. This is also very similar. If you notice, this is the life cycle of an attack, whether it's a red team or pen testers or a threat actor. These are those steps, similar steps that they need to conduct in order to do what they're trying to do. So same thing, initial compromise, persistence, escalation of privileges, etc. So this is what we would consider the methodology for conducting that type of attack. And so as I talk about these examples of attacks that I'm going to cover here in a moment, think about it from both the red team and how they're performing this attack, as well as how I outline the blue team and what they're looking for in the impact on the endpoint itself, because it's kind of interesting to think about it from both perspectives. Some of you might be more leaning towards offensive security, and some might be more on the defensive side, or even if you're on the fence about it, this is a really good way to kind of consider from all vantage points. And so while the attackers have to worry about the MITRE ATT&CK framework and coming up with methods to do this, the organizations that are defending don't have it much easier. So it's really easy to say, oh, I'll buy this security tool and everything's going to be simple. But the reality is this is what we call the pyramid of pain. Now, I was not clever enough to create this myself, but Matt Swan did. And there's a link, and I try to give credit where credit is due in all of this. So in my slides, you'll always find links to other things. And so this is the pyramid of pain. These are the steps that an organization has to take before they can get to that top one, which is act. So a lot of organizations, they try to react when they can. They try to solve problems. But looking at the base of this, if you don't know what your inventory of systems is, something very basic, if you don't know what systems you have in your network, how are you possibly going to defend against an attack? If you don't know, for example, where your unauthorized activity is coming from and you don't have detection, you're never going to have an alert to go and investigate. If you can't go and hunt for an attacker that might be in your environment, you're never going to be able to do the things below it. So the idea is you need to start with a good foundation as an organization. They need to be able to inventory and understand telemetry and build on top of this solid foundation, because security is always going to be stronger in a layered approach. I don't care what they say, there's no one tool out there that's going to solve all your problems. There's no one consulting firm that's going to fix an organization completely. You have to build layer upon layer of different techniques as an auditor or as a security practitioner to be able to do all of these things. So you'll never get to proactive threat hunting if you can't lock down your detection capabilities, things like that. So the pyramid of pain, just keep this in mind. It's always easy to look in the news or read about an organization that suffered a breach, and it's very, oh well, they must have, they must suck, they must not have the proper detection. The reality is they've got to master all of these things, and oftentimes it's a lot harder than people get credit for. So let's break this down into some real examples of attacks. So each one of these are attacks that I've spent a lot of time investigating. In this first one here, SamSam ransomware, I've handled probably a dozen of these cases. And it's kind of interesting because this isn't your typical ransomware where you get an attachment in your email or someone clicks the wrong thing. This is a group of threat actors that were essentially scanning the internet for remote desktop being exposed. Now, when they did that, I'll go through their whole methodology, but they would find these systems, they would brute force their way onto the network, map out the network and scan, find out what the company was, what they're worth, things like that, delete everything over a long weekend, and then ask for, it used to be about 70 to 250 grand in ransom. It varies quite a bit, but that's no small amount to walk into your office and see every computer and all of your backups are destroyed, and say, hey, if you pay us $250,000, your data's back. Now, I'll go through the methodology, but what's really interesting about this group is they set up essentially a bulletin board over Tor. So you could go to this website and communicate with them. And they would even let you upload 2 files that were encrypted to prove that they had the keys to decode your data. So we had some communication with them, and in all the cases I worked, they actually did pay the ransom, or they did release the decryption keys once we paid the ransom. Now, I would never suggest paying a ransom. Obviously, it's not a good idea, but for some of my customers, it was an issue of going out of business or paying the ransom. I had an architecture firm one time where they lost, it was like 15 years of architectural plans and drawings, and their backup was destroyed. And the IT person that hired us to do the investigation, it was his 3rd day of work there, and he had no idea what to do. So it's easy, like I said, to point the finger at the victims, but once in a while, there's scenarios and situations that you're not aware of, and these things really do happen. So your options are to essentially, if you get hit with something like this, to pay the ransom, or essentially rebuild your network, or hopefully you have a proper backup. But for most of my customers, that was not the case. How does this look from the threat actor's perspective? What are they doing? What does this, what does this involve if I wanted to be a bad guy, for example, and do this type of attack? So similar to that red pen testing methodology you saw, I'm going to walk through exactly what they do. First off, they enumerate their targets. They go to tools like Shodan or other services looking for a remote desktop that's exposed out to the internet. Once they have that, they automate it, and they add essentially those hosts to a botnet that is constantly trying default logon and passwords. Admin password, things like that. And once again, you might think, oh, well, most people wouldn't expose that. But the reality is there's dev networks out there, and all those edge cases I showed you, there are scenarios where these types of things happen, and it can be an entry point for this type of attack. Once they do that, they start enumerating the domains. So they get on the network, they look at where your backups are, they look at what type of data you have. Most of the time they're scouring for financial information, essentially finding what you're worth and what data is valuable to you.
Can I have a question?
Yeah, Aaron, we have a question.
Sure, yeah.
As the bad actors try to search for information, did they try to use a website like mylife.com to actually go and search everything about a person? I don't know if you have used that service.
That's a great question. So I can't specifically tell you what the threat actors did on the back end because I don't have forensic evidence to really tell me that, but it would not shock me one bit. So in many cases, beyond just looking at the financial information of the customers or of the company, I had one case where it was a law firm, and I offered them about a third of the ransom they were requesting. And they said, no, we know what you're worth. We know that the CEO or whatever it was is worth $3 million. And so paying us $300,000 should be no problem. So I can't prove that they did things like that, but it would not shock me one bit if they were to do reconnaissance to try and identify, who's running the company and what their financials and details might be as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that would be, and just like, from the threat actor's perspective, from the penetration testing side, from the legitimate security auditing side, you would do exactly the same thing. So maybe you're not interested in the financial well-being of the leaders of the organization, but you would do that same style research on what the systems are and what the versions of the tools are, and what might be normal or abnormal for their network. You're going to do a lot of that similar style of research on the network itself.
We have one more question.
He said that Samsung's ransomware specifically was an opportunity. Did he say most of what he encounters are attacks of opportunity, or does he encounter targeted attacks?
I'm sorry, I have a hard time hearing.
Yeah, I'm gonna repeat the question for you. For were the attacks general, or they were very specific for the companies? Is there some kind of like a broad network attack which goes out, or attackers are very specific about what companies they attack?
Certainly. So there are targeted attacks out there. There are threat acting groups out there that are targeting, biotech or manufacturing or these industries, and they have specific targets in mind. But what I find is most of the day-to-day investigations I come across are a little more crimes of opportunity. In this case, they're scanning for vulnerabilities across remote desktop. Or vulnerabilities, essentially exposing out remote desktop. In the next example, we'll talk about some other ones, but in these cases, it's typically they're looking for any organization that meets their criteria rather than targeting a specific one.
Does it answer the question?
Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah, and so to give you an idea, with SamSam, most of the time it's medium-sized businesses, but I've seen state organizations, law firms, engineering firms, HR, lots of different companies and style of organizations get hit by just this one group. Now, this group was arrested. It was 2 Iranian fellows that were charged with this, and they were purported, I believe, to make $24 million off these attacks, if that gives you any idea of how much money they get by doing this. For the sake of time, I'm just going to kind of speed up a little bit on this methodology. I want to make sure we cover a few other things here. But so lateral movement, what they're doing is they go from system to system. And if they don't have the permissions or the account that they need, they're running a tool like Mimikatz or Windows Credential Editor, which are malicious tools that dump passwords from systems. So an attacker or a red teamer can use these tools to get clear text passwords that have been cached on the system. And it happens all the time where there's a service account or some administrator account that's been logged into. They run this tool, and now they have the password of that account. Once they have that access, they essentially have keys to the kingdom. So let's say they gain domain administrator rights to the network. Oops, there we go. They basically have keys to the kingdom. They move to the domain controller and push out their ransomware, typically over a weekend to give it time to encrypt everything. And so once that's done, the ransom note pops up, and you have no real choice in the matter. It's you have, I believe it's typically 7 to 14 days to pay the ransom, or all your data is gone permanently forever. And so they put that time constraint on there to really make this as difficult as possible for the victims and to make it a little more urgent for them. So now that we know what the attack looks like, let's talk about all the different signs that you could have as a security auditor or as a blue team, a defender in your environment, all the different things that would have or maybe should have set off some alarm bells for these organizations. So first off, any good organization that's wanting to stay ahead of the game here, they're going to be constantly scanning for vulnerabilities against their systems. That's a pretty common practice. Vulnerability scanning, you can automate this, you can do a lot of stuff, but vulnerability management is really important. The next thing they would have seen was when they started doing all the brute forcing of logons for that account, some type of SIM or some type of interrogation on security event logs would have seen a lot of account logon failures before they got the password right. In addition to that, being able to know easily which systems are exposing remote desktop, which systems have established connections or listening. Each one of these would be just as important to understand what's happening prior to a breach. And then should you become a victim, these are those steps during that breach that you should be able to identify. Mass enumeration of domains and users in groups, dumping credentials, use of tools like PSExec. Each one of these, there should be some type of security control around to help identify, like, this might be a bad thing that's happening in our environment. Clearing security event logs should not be happening regularly. If it does, I want to know about it. So these are the types of things that some of your security tools and technologies should be letting you know that are occurring. That way you don't fall victim to these style attacks. The next example I have is Emotet. You've probably also heard of Emotet. If you notice, I'm trying not to name any customers or even public organizations that have been impacted by these, but these are really common to happen. So Emotet is, I believe, the most common phishing attack out there. So it's a series of payloads that you can choose and it's typically delivered via phishing attack. Now, in most cases, they're macros, meaning that you get an email and it has a attachment in it, and when you run that Excel document or that Word file or PDF, when you kick that off, it runs a secondary script in the background, and you don't know that it happened. That script is really doing all the bad stuff. Now, there are other ways that it executes, but for the sake of simplicity here, let's just talk about those attachments. That macro is probably going to go out and download other malware. It's going to reach out to a command and control server and send data about what type of antivirus you have on the system, any other locations of interesting things that are happening. And then once it does that, it's going to download and run several tools. This is where it gets kind of interesting because it's very, very modular. You can buy access to this tool and you can specify what things you want to run. So for example, there's one called Outlook Scraper, and it's going to go and grab all your usernames or email addresses rather and passwords out of Outlook. There's Mail Pass View. It's going to go and grab your cached credentials. Web Browser Pass View is going to go and any browser saved passwords that are there. And then it's going to try and spread and go to other SMB shares on your network, exposed file shares, and do the same thing over again. So it spreads incredibly fast, it's stealthy, and it's more importantly, it's stealing your sensitive data. So this is something that's happening very commonly. And Emotet, if you Google it, you'll find there are hundreds of different payloads that are doing all kinds of different stuff here, PowerShell.net, all over the place. So it's really powerful stuff and pretty interesting in my opinion. But this is an example of something that's harder to find because once it's in your network, cleaning it up can be very, very difficult. One thing I'll also mention here is it's polymorphic, which I did not address. So a lot of antivirus tools out there, you might be thinking, oh, well, if you have antivirus, it should block this. But polymorphic means that parts of the code are actually changing when it goes from one host to another. So the samples are never the same exact. And so I find that a lot of antivirus tools and vendors out there struggle to keep up with detection on this because it's changing so rapidly. Now, there are some tools out there that do. I'm not saying there aren't, but this is a more difficult problem for a lot of medium-sized businesses to get ahead of. So how would we detect this? So we know how this gets in. Like I said, this is a phishing attack. So from the red team side, this one's pretty simple. You enumerate your users. You send them all a fairly decent email, and the law of numbers comes into play. With phishing, I read a statistic not too long ago. It was for every 1,000 emails that an attacker sends out, you'll get one person to click on something at least. And I think that that's actually a pretty good number. Your odds are pretty good as an attacker that somebody's going to click on something they shouldn't. So how do we defend against that? What is the impact on the endpoint, and what kind of tooling would we be able to see this? Well, first off, mail and spam filtering. There's no way of getting around that. Most organizations have at least a basic one, but there's always going to be a file that gets through the filter. So being able to look at historical execution of what happened. So rather than say, hey, did this happen right now? Who clicked on that link? We can't always trust that a user is going to call the help desk and say they clicked on something they shouldn't have. So we need to be able to interrogate our systems and find out what processes ran, ideally in a process tree situation here. So being able to identify suspicious ancestry, for example, Outlook opening up an Excel attachment and then Excel spawning a command prompt. That should not be happening. And here's an example of it from the tool in the company I work at here, Tanium, which I'll talk about a little bit more as well. But being able to identify what processes are launching what and in a historical manner, because most of the time in incident response, we're looking back in time, not necessarily always forward in exactly what happened. And then other things like credential dumping tools and network connections going out to domains that have been dynamically generated. All of these types of things should be setting off those alarm bells in a properly locked down network. So the auditors and the security audit piece here is really important to understand that these are the types of capabilities you might need for your investigation should it happen. All right, so with that, what we've talked about now is how the attackers are breaking in, what they're doing, some of the red team side of the attack side, as well as what the impact is on the endpoint. But What's important is also just to give you an idea of what some of these tools are. Now, obviously, I'm not here to sell you anything. My company, Tanium, we make a security software. We make a security and operations software, but I specifically focus on endpoint detection and response. And so my job and my team is really meant around creating and having the artifacts that a responder needs to do their investigation, to make sure that everything is being properly recorded, and we can go and have that data available to us. So it's important to kind of understand, regardless of the tool that you're looking at when it comes to EDR, what they need to be able to do at a bare minimum. So for example, for incident response, you need to be able to know what the current state is. Just like that inventory we were talking about in the pyramid of pain, I need to know what type of active processes and connections and artifacts are happening right now on the systems. In addition, I need to be able to look at the files and entries and artifacts that are on disk, but at rest. So in our case, we index all the metadata about our file system and constantly keep a journal of that data so we can ask at any given time, hey, which file with this hash has been seen across our network? And then lastly, we keep historical context. So we're recording and keeping a database of everything that's happening on the endpoint with regards to network and process and registry and even security and event logs. So we're keeping an active log of all of that data. That way, should something happen, when you want to go and investigate it, you can trust that that data is there for you. Any questions about this piece? Because I know that this might seem a little different from your traditional antivirus. EDR to me and endpoint detection and response is kind of the next evolution of the antivirus game or incident response. The fact that antivirus's methodology is that they want to block everything bad that's going to happen. Whereas with EDR, it's more of a fact, it's just a matter of time until something gets through that shouldn't. And should that happen, we need to have everything available to us to figure out exactly what did happen. So it's kind of creating that audit log of behaviors.
Any questions? We have one question. Go ahead.
So the email that also be similar to or be exactly like the ads or public that say you need to update your Flash player and it downloads the file. Would it be similar to that, or would it be something else?
So a student here wants to know what's the email attack like? Is it kind of similar, like, your Flash player needs to be updated, or what are the emails like for the bot?
Yeah, great question. And so these range, this is really where the creativity of either the pen tester or the attacker really comes into play. In my mind, what makes for an effective phishing campaign is something that either invokes urgency or it's details about your organization that are very sensitive. So an example of that, I used to work with a group of pen testers, and they like to send one out, an urgent message from HR saying that if you don't sign up by today, your HR benefits are going to expire. And so by doing that and putting the 1 day on it, the level of urgency, they don't take the time to critically think about what's happening. They think, oh crap, my benefits are going to expire. Let me click that link and go type in my username and password. That's one way they do it. The other way that I also find is really effective is sending out an email by accident. You can't see, I'm doing air quotes. That doesn't really help when the video's off, but sending an email by accident. So HR sending a salary detail document out, or upcoming layoffs, things that might be juicy enough to get a user to click on it to see what's happening in their environment, see what's going on with their organization. Those are always very, very effective. There's a website called FishMe, and it's a service, it's a vendor I have no affiliation with, but they've also got some very clever posts that they have on their blog about different style attacks and the behaviors of their victims, because they're doing it as a service to help train organizations to be more defensive against these type of attacks. But I would say urgency and sensitive information are the two most effective that I've seen in the wild. And then as far as the delivery, sometimes it is, let's say, an Excel document or a spreadsheet, Other times, other methods I've seen would be including like a link to a fake DocuSign or a Dropbox, where when you click on it, it redirects you somewhere else and has you download it. So oftentimes it will say, oh, in order to read this sensitive DocuSign document, you must download this plugin. And as soon as you hit that button, it's game over.
We have one more question.
So for example, if, I definitely have a virus on my computer that is based from the result of when I was just downloading a book, and every time I search for it to try and quarantine it with Malwarebytes, it says that it's not able to find it, and then it gives me a notification that it's been updated in the background, that like install pdfmaker.com or whatever that I downloaded has been updated in the background, but I can't find it anywhere on my computer. So like, how would one go about doing something like that?
So in that particular case, it sounds like Malwarebytes maybe can't get a grasp on the file operation or the process itself. I would honestly try a second tool. Now, I do not work for, and in fact, I probably shouldn't be recommending any in particular, but for example, ESET has a free online antivirus scanner. Cylance, I believe, has one as well. There are other tools out there to do it. The real way, if you want to be just nuke it from orbit, would be, I think Avira offers a free bootable antivirus USB stick. And the real way to do this would be to boot outside of your operating system. That way that virus can't load, and then use a tool to scan the disk to clean it up. That way it can't stop anything from clearing it up.
So how does the virus update in the background when it knows that I'm scanning for viruses in general?
So it's pretty common for certain types of malware out there to look for common tools that would clean it up. Malwarebytes and other antivirus tools. It could be as simple as having a routine in the process saying, if this other process runs, kill it or do this behavior. Used to be really common to see that type of thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I believe Avira is the bootable one, yeah.
Let's say that most of us are using Gmail. So one of the kind of like misunderstanding is that every email go to Gmail would be scan and check. But then in order for Gmail to scan and check, one way or the other, you may have to open that email, right?
Certainly.
But then by that time, it is too late.
Yeah, there's tools out there, and so Gmail and a lot of these, they will do their best to interrogate an email. So for example, if they've got an attachment of an executable or a document, Gmail or these other tools might go and scan those and see if they've seen it before or if it has known malicious behavior associated with it, but they're not going to be perfect. And then attackers are always getting creative. That's also part of the fun part about red team and blue team is as soon as there's a new detection to block an attack, attackers come up with a new way to get past it. So it's kind of this constant evolution of attackers versus defenders. But yeah, in those cases, the attachments, some of them are always going to get through. And if you want to do investigation on that, there are other tools that can kind of look at those attachments and follow those links and do what we call sandboxing or static analysis on them. So for example, like VirusTotal, if you had a link of something malicious that you were interested in, you could go to virustotal.com and paste that link in, and it would tell you, has anybody else has anyone else seen this before? Does it have known malware in it? And they might even tell you what the malware is and details about it.
One more question on that part. So if I open my Gmail, I have a list of, let's say, email just sent to me. If I click on the checkbox and try to find some information regarding about that email, is it possible doing just that? Check, but not open it?
So in the cases that I'm showing here, and in most, it would require you to actually double click and follow a link or actually download and execute something. Just checking the box or viewing the email in almost every case is not going to be enough to get an exploit. The user would have to either open the attachment or enable macros or follow on with a second step. And that's really where they get you. But just viewing that email or seeing that you got one should not be a problem.
Thank you.
Awesome. All right. No more questions?
I have a question.
Sure, one more question.
How vulnerable is it allowing cookies?
So the question is how safe or unsafe it is to allow cookies. Can one function without allowing cookies?
You know, this is it's really going to be a matter of what your personal risk factor is. You know, there are situations where you know, if you're a journalist or a privacy advocate in a country that's restricting access to the internet, you might have a higher risk profile, and you might need to block cookies and other attachments and scripts from running because you're constantly under attack. In most cases, do I think you need to disable cookies? Probably not. There are some cases where it would be useful, but I would say rather than focus on cookies, I would be more interested in what types of scripts and other redirects are happening. So personally, I prefer things like uBlock Matrix and some other ad blocking tools out there, and Privacy Badger by the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Things that are looking more to stop third-party spying rather than malicious cookies.
Thank you.
If you feel that if you feel that you are a high-risk target for any reason at all, by all means, you could disable cookies. It's going to break functionality on certain websites, and it's going to be generally a pain in the rear for certain behaviors. But you could do that if you feel you are at risk. But at that point, I would be running NoScript and a series of other privacy-centric extensions on my browser.
How about links that are sent via text? They tell you to click on that link. They text you a link to click on.
Yeah, links, that's the other very common method here. So rather than send an attachment, they'll say, hey, here's a link to a DocuSign or whatever it might be, and you click on the link. In most cases, clicking the link will not be enough to compromise the host. There are situations where there's a drive-by exploit, for example, and you're using Internet Explorer and it's not patched, then yes, it's possible to get infected just by going to a website. But in most of these cases, they're sending you to a website, and that website will tell you, oh, you need a tool to download this or to view this file, or you need to conduct this step. Maybe it's log on, enter your username and password, things like that. That's really how they're trying to get that data.
Cool. We'll keep going.
Cool. Yeah, great questions. Actually, that's pretty much all I had as far as this goes. Yeah, so just to kind of close things up with this piece, whether it's, you know, whatever tool you want to use or whatever your profile is for analyzing activity or behavior, whether it's red team or blue team or somewhere in the middle, which is becoming more common, being able to have this data at your fingertips is imperative. Going back to that pyramid of pain, you're not going to be able to do any of this until you have proper control over your environment and starting with that basic inventory and moving forward. So what I like to just show on this is just the fact that, you know, whether it's the red team working on attacking and relying on a lack of these items, or the blue team trying to build up this pyramid to make it harder, it's a really interesting place to be, and I find it fascinating. It's one of the biggest things I really like about this industry is no 2 days are the same, and just when you think you've come up with a way to stop something from happening, the attackers get more creative or the defenders get more creative. So I really enjoy it for that reason. So that's all I had as far as slides go, as far as this goes. When it comes to those questions, let me pull those back up so we can go do some of that. And so one last thing I put on here, I normally put go make something awesome, but the reality is in our industry, sometimes you got to break it too. So whatever it is your interests are in whatever realm of security that you find to be the most entertaining or interesting for you, go make it or go break something awesome and have fun doing it, because that's really the best part about this. All right.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
I have one
Sweet.
more question. Thank you so much.
We will take questions.
Great questions in here.
Okay, cool. Let me also switch to the questions. I'm gonna try to share.
Yeah, I got this document up too.
You do, or
Yep.
okay, cool. All right, then I'll let you do that.
Perfect. So I'm just going to go starting from the top, and if you do want more detail, just let me know. How did I get started in security? Well, I was kind of lucky. I had always been somewhat interested in it. I was always told I had a little bit of a problem with authority, I guess you could tell, or you could say. And on a computer, it was interesting to me to be told I couldn't do something with a computer. And so I would spend time making it do what it wasn't supposed to. Whether it was, I think my first foray into hacking was adding my name to the top of the Minesweeper high score list so I could beat my brother when I was like 8. So it's a matter of, it sparked an interest in it. And then when it came to security, I went to DEF CON, which is a computer hacking and computer security conference in Las Vegas. It's actually in about 3 weeks. I went there for the first time right out of college. And in the airport, I met a guy and I started talking about my interests. And the next day I flew out for an interview and had a job doing incident response consulting. So I got into security mainly by being curious and learning a lot. But then after that, it was really about networking and talking to people about what I'm passionate about. And then, somebody took a chance on me. As far as what inspired me, I think I just kind of covered that. It was really a matter of, trying to do something different. I had always been glued to my computer from a young age. But the idea of, either locking down and investigating, for me, I got into the blue team side because it really bothered me that people were out there pushing malware and stealing credit cards and doing bad things. When I said I was younger and got into hacking, it was always, kind of fun and innocent stuff, but it always bothered me when people were doing the bad stuff. So I wanted to stop and make companies more secure and stop that type of thing from happening. Previous roles or projects that drove me nuts. For me, I've always been really good about it, but the issue that I had was with burnout. So in incident response, and I believe I covered this a while back as well, as with incident response, it's very common to put in long hours, be on call, and really kind of a stressful environment, especially if you're in consulting. And so for that, it was really challenging trying to find a balance between, work-life balance and happiness, both with technical work and learning and, having a personal life as well. Man, you guys have some great questions. I really appreciate that. What shifts and trends have you seen in the industry? What I think is really becoming more and more popular. I think that it's hard to essentially delineate between the marketing hype of a lot of security vendors out there and what's really functioning and what's working. And part of that, I might just be a little bit jaded by going to these conferences everywhere, but there's a lot of security vendors out there that they're selling, solutions to problems that you don't have or over exaggerating and things like that. So I think there's been a lot of hype around tooling and technology that just doesn't really meet what the market needs, in my opinion. That being said, there's some really cool stuff that's happening too. I think automation and orchestration, so taking security incident response, that's something that you're doing on a daily basis, and automating that, and basically having APIs and automation protocols to transfer data and between different tools. I think the orchestration piece is going to be really, really big and only going to get bigger. So for that industry, you might hear it called SOAR, security operation. Oh, I'm going to butcher this. What is it? Security orchestration. And all right, I'm going to cheat. Hold on one second. SOAR platform. Sorry, I should know this off the top of my head. Security orchestration, automation, and response. Sorry about that. And that's where you can essentially say, hey, I have an alert coming in from this location. I want to interrogate it. I want it then to go and grab these details from this other system, go and correlate these logs, and if it meets these criteria, knock the system offline. Basically creating flowcharts of behaviors based on events. I think that's going to be really, really big out there. What education? Honestly, for me, when I'm hiring, education is obviously important, but what I'm looking for the most out of anything is curiosity. For me, it's what types of projects are you working on? It's not everyone has the same opportunity to go and grab every SANS cert out there that are very expensive, or go get a master's degree. It's great if you do have that capability, and certainly it's going to open up more opportunity. But what I'm looking for the most as far as education goes is somebody that has tried hands-on, whether it's in a professional or in a self-taught manner, and trying to solve problems, trying to investigate and do things on their own and create projects and working in the industry like that. That's what I'm looking for the most. But as far as education goes, having a degree and then understanding the basics of whether or not it's, security, defense, or operations, whatever your interest is, getting the basics locked down and knowing them and being able to talk about them passionately will do wonders for you when it comes time to getting a job. Typical day at Tanium. What a typical day at Tanium, I'm on a little bit of a niche team. A lot of our folks at Tanium are assisting our customers deploy our software and manage their networks. My job is a little different. I spend most of my time researching, looking at threats and new activity that's happening, vulnerabilities and exploits and behaviors, and helping figure out how we can detect and block it in our environment. So the example here is Bluekeep came out not too long ago. It's a worm-style remote desktop exploit. And in that particular case, I was looking at how we can use Tanium to find that across the large organizations that we secure. And so we worked on that and came up with some methods like that. So a lot of that is in the research realm. And then I also do a lot of hands-on helping customers solve problems, whether they have an incident, helping them investigate it and leverage our platform for getting the details that they need. What prerequisites are required for obtaining a job or an internship at Tanium? Tanium's a great company. We have a lot of opportunity, and we do have a intern program. In fact, it's my fault. I was supposed to pass on those details a little earlier. So I will send over and make sure that there's an intro so that the team here has access to that, and make sure that you've got any opportunity I can to get you into Tanium, whether it's in an internship role or in a professional capacity. I would love to do so. But really, it's a matter of we are looking. Tanium is fairly picky, quite honestly. They are looking at grades and projects and your motivation level. Like I said, that curiosity and what types of projects you're working on will go a really far way at Tanium. And I think a lot of other companies as well. Craziest story about cybersecurity. All right, I'm going to keep this one kind of short because we have some other questions, but I was working a case for a large cruise line company, and that cruise line company got hit with a credit card stealing malware, and the cost of satellite internet for a cruise ship, for me to be able to remote into that network and find the malware and clean it up, the cost of the internet was so slow and so expensive that they actually brought somebody's vacation cruise into port a day early so we could get a faster internet connection for me to solve the problem. That's probably one of the crazier ones I have. Yeah, so if somebody got a day less of their vacation, but the reality is we stopped probably about 1.5 million credit cards from being stolen, so it was probably a fair trade-off.
Did you get a cruise out of it?
I was always promised, but I never made it out there to get it. I really should have taken them up on it. Do attackers tend to use automated attacks out of laziness to save time, or does it aid them? It's a little bit of both. I think a lot of it is a matter of not having to do the same thing over and over again. The attacks that I'm talking about here, since they're not focused on a specific organization or target, they want to just kind of shoot wide and see what comes back. And so a lot of times they're automating just to make it faster for them to do this. I would say, yeah, there's a little bit of laziness associated with it, just to kind of save time. But anonymity is another thing about it. So if I can easily, or if they can easily write a script that's going to provide more anonymity in what they're doing, they would certainly do that as well. So I would say it's a combination of both. From the track section of the pyramid of pain, what do you actually see when observing adversary activity? Another excellent question. So with that, it's tough because every organization is going to be different. In the track section, what we're really looking for is, can we see what they're doing and ideally understand some of their motive of what they're targeting? So when I'm working for a manufacturing or a biotech company, I typically know that they're targeting research and development, for example. If it's a bank, they're typically targeting card information or other sensitive documents. So with this one, it's a matter of kind of understanding what the attack was to begin with, and that kind of lets you know where their level of expertise is. Were they using really common tactics and caught the organization with their pants down, or did they use a 0-day exploit, one of those advanced tactics? Those types of behaviors are going to help us profile and understand what the motivations of those attackers might be. But every organization is going to have different artifacts available to them. Some are going to be for the better, some are going to be for the worse, and so we may not see anything at all depending on the company. Let's see here. Are these online services that reveal vulnerable computers? What is their purpose? So Shodan itself is really a legitimate tool. It is essentially a mass network scanner. It's going out and port scanning the entire internet over and over again. It's not malicious by nature. You can actually opt out of it. You can tell it to ignore your IP space, but people don't. And the reality is, for every service like Shodan out there, there's hundreds of other malicious ones doing the same exact thing. So in this particular case, it's really meant to bring visibility into poorly exposed networks, would be my opinion. But they serve threat intelligence purposes as well. So I think their main purpose for making money is selling you a service, helping you fingerprint systems in your environment, find misconfigurations, and find things that might be exposed that you didn't know about. All right. When you mentioned ransom, how are they paid? Wouldn't there be a footprint or paper trail? So in all the ransom cases I've worked, it's Bitcoin. And so the money is transferred via Bitcoin. More specifically, the company would essentially send my company, my old company, not Tanium, we don't do that, would send my old company basically a check or a money order, and we would then go and purchase Bitcoin, make the transfer, and you're quite right. So while there's no physical paper trail, Bitcoin is inherently a giant ledger of activity. So we do work with government organizations when the victim wants us to. So I wouldn't just call the FBI for no reason on my own, but if the organization said, you know what, let's get the FBI involved, I would share with them the payment information, malware details, and everything else. I can't prove it, but I like to think that part of those details that we shared were part of the reason that those threat actors, those 2 Iranian men, were arrested for this. Can't prove it, like I said, but it is kind of a nice thing to think about after spending countless hours trying to stop it. So automation, how attackers automate their attacks? What are we to automate defense? Well, that's where that SOAR platform, I think, really comes into play. Taking your common day-to-day behaviors and automating those, whether it's investigating phishing attacks or malware or changing passwords, whatever it might be, that's a task that needs to be done over and over again. We can leverage those tools like SOAR platforms. And I'm not advocating for any of them, but to give you an idea, there's tools out there. One is called Phantom, one is called Demisto, and one is called Swim Lane. I'm not telling you which one's the best or anything like that, but each one offers the ability to automate and work with multiple different tools at one time to solve a problem. And I think that's more and more how we're going to get ahead of the threat actors, is by doing that. What is in the middle between red and blue team? What is a purple team? Great question as well. So purple team is really the fact that for any good pen test, you need, let me rephrase this. So to be a good defensive blue team member, you need to know what impact is happening on the endpoint, right? You need to know, hey, this is what an attack looks like. For the red team, their goal is to attack and get into networks and perform different functions. they don't necessarily consider what impact that leaves on the system other than if it affects them getting their access. So for example, a red team attacker might run Mimikatz to get passwords, but they may not consider the fact that that's going to set off an antivirus alert. They might only think about that if it stops from executing because the antivirus blocked it. So a purple team is when you get red team and blue team members together, or maybe you have somebody that has both skill sets, and it's working smarter to perform this behavior. So on the blue side, or rather a purple team can do both defense in understanding the attacker's methods, as well as an attacker understanding a level above what they're currently doing and saying, okay, well, if I perform this, the blue team is going to see this, and I can circumvent that by doing X, Y, Z. So it's kind of a combination of the two together. Do you need a college degree or certification to be a cybersecurity professional? That's kind of a loaded question. I don't think it's necessarily required. I think it's going to make things probably significantly easier, in my opinion, and that's just my opinion. I think that having a degree in IT or a security-related focus would be a lot easier of a sell to a hiring manager than if you did not. Now, that being said, I know plenty of people that did not have a college degree but went and got some certifications and demonstrated a basic understanding of a lot of different realms, and they got a job. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but I do think it's going to create a few additional hurdles for you. That being said, if you're passionate about it, I think that it's possible to get a job as long as you can demonstrate those skills, because there is a national shortage in cybersecurity. I think the last number I heard was it's going to be upwards of 800,000 people as a shortage for professionals in the next couple of years. That number could be wrong, so don't quote me on it, but there's a significant number of shortage of professionals in this realm. What advice would I give to a beginner? I would say, stay curious. If you don't understand something, before you ask somebody what the answer is, do some research, look into it. You'll learn a little bit more than just the answer. You'll learn how something works, and over time, you're going to build that knowledge up and really get into a really good place where you understand a lot of different things and how things operate between each others. How can others gain knowledge in my specialties? So my specialty has always been digital forensics and incident response. So staying active in the community. There are a lot of good groups out there, public and private organizations for individuals in information security and incident response. I was just at DFRWS, which is a digital forensics conference in Portland this week. And and beyond just the presentations, networking with people and learning about what interests them, that can be really good for learning and understanding more. And that being said, there's tons of great resources online, whether it's watching videos or researching, learning how attacks and defense work. There's so many people that are so smart and create a lot of learning content out there. So just Google around or search around, and you'll find a lot of stuff. And if you are specifically interested in my path a little bit more, I'd be happy to share some of those resources with you. All right. What advice do you have for career success in terms of getting hired, climbing the ladder, and or starting a security company? That's another that's a big question right there. When in terms of getting hired, like I said, show that you're hungry, you learn quickly, you want to solve problems on your own, and you're interested in the content. To me, that's the biggest aspect of getting hired. Once you get the job, always still be hungry. Always be looking for that next step, whether it's additional training or an area of expertise that you didn't know about or haven't really looked into. For example, I know almost nothing about container and micro virtualization. And so I've been reading about that, trying to learn more about that. It's not going to help me necessarily for my career, but by learning a bit more about it, I can start understanding and talking with other customers about it, and it helps improve my capability in the realm. So just stay hungry and keep learning things. And cybersecurity, starting a company, I don't have an answer for that. I've been trying to figure that one out for the last 10 years. When I have an answer to that, I will start my own company. How do you stay updated? /r netsec. So Reddit, whether your opinion on Reddit is one thing, the netsec subreddit is outstanding. It's a great way, even if you just check it once a day or two. There's tons of great articles in there, and I would say it's probably one of my most viewed sites as far as learning about new attacks and things that are happening in the network security realm. So yeah, the NetSec subreddit is pretty powerful in that regard. Podcasts, I really like Risky Business and a few of these other podcasts that are out there. Just talking about a random subject every time. You'd be surprised after a year of listening, all the things that you've learned in that regard. As far as the changing landscape, keep an eye on the conferences. So the big ones like the big ones like Black Hat and RSA, while they are very vendor-centric and there's a lot of marketing hype, if you look at even just the topics of the presentations, you can kind of get an idea of what's changing in the industry. The one I'm seeing right now is more and more of a push to go into a passwordless society, where Microsoft and others are looking at identity management where users don't have to type in a password. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff where if you're continually researching and learning, you'll find all kinds of fun stuff like that. What IR advice would you give to an individual that's hacked? Well, yeah, so in a limited resource scenario, oftentimes the least painful method is, unless you're really concerned with how it happened or what was taken, is to do as much research or investigation as you can, and just wipe the systems, or wipe to a state where you have reasonable belief that your network is secure. So if you need to redo all your accounts and things like that, it'll be it's going to be a headache, but doing it now is going to be better than living with a potential risk of IR. In the case of a nonprofit with limited resources, you'd be surprised a lot of IR organizations, IR consulting firms, will either give you a very good deal or even work pro bono in some cases. So if you are a nonprofit specifically, you might have some additional options available. In that case as well, if you want to reach out to me with more specifics, while I can't do IR consulting with my current position, I'd be happy to provide a few additional tips and tricks specific to whatever it is you're seeing. With tech-related jobs, I've heard the burnout rate is high. Is it common for someone that works in cybersecurity to move more into a management role? Yes, it really is. So there are different companies out there that some of them value time more than others. So burnout is something that is real. And it's something that you should address when you're trying to interview with jobs. It may not be as simple as saying, hey, are you working 80 hours a week? But you can generally ask some basic questions of employees to gauge whether or not burnout is a real factor. Management does come along, whether or not it's burnout or just after enough years in the industry, it's time to kind of either specialize or kind of move into a managerial role to help guide others. But yeah, I would say burnout is a big concern. Would you ever get the FBI involved if a client asked you not to? The only time I've ever had that happen is in the situation of child pornography. So that is the only, as far as I'm aware, that is the only legally required situation where I am mandated to call the FBI immediately in those cases. In any other situation for consulting, I can strongly suggest that they contact the FBI or that this information might be useful, but I cannot force anyone to do that, nor would I ever go out of bounds to contact them myself. The child situation is the only time that we would do that. And in that case, no matter what your position is, if you ever find that on any system during an investigation, your first call is to the FBI, not to anybody else. I've come across that before, and it's a very big deal if you do not call them first. So just keep that in mind. And then the last one, if you attack the attackers, are you a hero or a villain? This strongly depends on what country's jurisdiction you are in and where your own moral beliefs are. So in the United States, backhacking is what we call it, essentially attacking a group of attackers or hacking somebody that's hacking you. Backhacking is a as far as I know, I'm not a lawyer. It does violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and probably the Patriot Act as well. So you should not do it in the United States. It is illegal, and you can be prosecuted for it. The hero or the villain, I think that there are situations where we should take a more aggressive stance towards hacking, and whether or not that's doing a little bit of it ourselves to defend and learn more about our attackers. It's kind of a murky water situation, but in most cases, you got to go by the law, and the law here is you cannot do that.
Man, we actually did make it through that long list. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's a great set of questions. I'm very impressed. Thank you all very.
I think my strategy of forcing students to write down questions worked, huh? So any other questions while we have Aaron on the phone, on Zoom here, and also want to be sensitive.
I'll do my best to. I'm sorry?
Oh, I also want to be sensitive to your time, so just making sure. You have a few more minutes?
Yeah, I'll be wrapping up here in just a second. I just wanted to make sure that, when it comes to incident response or career advice in this regard, I'm happy to provide as much detail as honestly and straightforward as I can. So feel free to reach out in that regard. I'll do my best. I am fairly busy, but I try to respond pretty quickly. I think it's the incident responder in me.
Right. So I'll reach out to you with regards to the internship follow-up as well as nonprofit IR and couple of resources you said you would have more details on. So I'll follow up with you with regards to that. And then if you are able to share the slides, please do. But having said that, we are recording all the lectures and they are available on the course page. And I hope it's okay, Aaron, for your lecture to appear there as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll post a copy of this. I'll get that over to you shortly, and that's not a problem at all.
Okay, that's perfect. Awesome. Any other questions, comments? Can we do a round of applause for...
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today, and I hope that this sparks some interesting topics of conversation for you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Be in touch. Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Great stuff. So an innocent email is not innocent at all until your life is over.